Hi, Misha here, and today let's talk about the Russian RPGs, the rocket-propelled grenades. Had you going, didn't I? Yes, I know. That is not an accurate translation, especially for the RPG2. No, this is the handheld anti-tank grenade launcher or grenade gun or anti-tank gun. An implement for just that, at least initially. With the 2, it really was just an anti-armor. In fact, there's no rocket involved in this one. With the 7, though, its capabilities and roles would really expand from armor out to anti-infantry, just material in general, even anti-aircraft. And it is still not just in service, but in production today. The RPG2 was really the first successful weapon of its type, exceedingly simple. The RPG7, still very simple, is the most widespread weapon of its type, not only successful in the communist world and the third world, but has also become successful in the West, in the first world, in the capitalist world. If it works, it works. It's a cheap way to turn 1 or 2 men into a tank-killing team. It's a good exchange on investment when you're talking military hardware. And this isn't something we typically do on this channel, but the opportunity came about, so why not talk about them? We've actually had a video on the 2 in the long past, but a fresh batch came in. This is from Atlantic Firearms. And this, the 7, is from Numeric. These have been available for a little while. Both are original, not trainers, but both have been demilled per ATF specifications, so we'll look at how they did that. But we're mostly just going to talk about the history and the features, where they're at in the world today, and look at some accessories available at both Atlantic and Numeric for these. I don't know, seem kind of apropos of everything else going on right now. But the truth is, I've actually been planning this video since December, so just kind of how timing worked out this time. But with that, yeah, let's dive into the past, going actually into the waning days of World War II. And of course, we begin with the RPG2. This was the first successful handheld anti-tank recoilless grenade launcher, projectile launcher, really produced in Russia and really the first of its type. But I don't think you'd be surprised to learn, since its name 2, it was not the first designed. The original RPG1 began development in 1944, so still during World War II. And it was based on really examining the American bazooka and the German Panzerfaust anti-tank recoilless type guns. And Russia very blatantly studied what worked and what didn't, and wanted to create something of their own. So in 1945, the earliest prototypes were kind of being produced and tested, and they were using a 30mm cartridge, black powder, kind of wrapped, attached to a 70mm warhead, and pretty simple, straightforward tube. But it did have several improvements over the Panzerfaust and the bazooka, but it had some oddities too. For example, part of the warhead was on the outside of the tube, the part that had the fins, namely. And so this required a longer tube and required the sights to be further set back and just made it a bit more awkward. On top of that, while the RPG-1 was able to penetrate up to about 150mm of armor and was good out to about 75 to 80 meters, That was good enough in 1944, but by the post-war period, while they were working on it, armor had advanced. So it was looking dated. And they were trying to make it work. But in 1947, another program got started at the GSKB, the Design Bureau. They had worked on developing munitions during the war, but actually post-war, they were assigned to the Soviet Agricultural Bureau, making farm equipment. But since the major firearms and artillery and whatnot makers were busy, they were given the task of what would become the RPG2 here. And the key thing, they started with a new 40mm propellant cartridge. And it was attached to an 80mm, actually about an 82mm warhead. And it was a simple tube, as you can tell, just a metal tube made of steel, no flaring. Have a wooden shield to protect the user from heat or cold on the tube. This is a recoilless rifle. It uses a black powder charge to propel the warhead out. It is single action only, with a simple cross bolt safety. You can still cock it with the safety on, but that's it. And it uses either this type of sling that has the leather end caps, or it uses the standard Russian World War II submachine gun and Mosin and everything kind of sling. And it has very basic iron sights that fold up. The front is just a notch post. The rear has a couple of crude settings. Grips are wood here, and that's really kind of it. Nothing fancy at all. But they did begin testing on this, and it was enough of a leap forward from the RPG1 that in 1948 that program was canceled, and this program was allowed to progress, and it was eventually adopted for Red Army service in 1954. It took a little time to get it going, I suppose. See, they're attached here. Just a steel tube. And of course the exhaust goes out of the back. It is very lightweight, as you see it here. Just a hair over 6 pounds. But that's before we install our warhead. As I said at the beginning, this came from Atlantic this time. We've had them from other sources before. And these are coming with dummy practice training warheads, grenades. That's kind of neat because they do give the right weight and size. With the complete assembled warhead inserted, it's over 10 pounds. The tube itself is a little over 37 inches. With the warhead, it's about 47 inches, so it adds about 10 inches to the overall length. Still very lightweight when you consider this could knock out a tank. This warhead was rated to penetrate up to 180 millimeter of armor, which was enough to knock out most post-World War II tanks into the 1950s. Even if it couldn't punch through the front on some of the later ones, it could still knock through the side. And they only had this one type, the PG2, which is a high explosive anti-tank, a heat round. It didn't have a rocket accelerator, but one advancement with the RPG2, it had metal fins, 6 of them in total, that were actually in the back folded up, and when it went out, they would kind of unfold to help guide the projectile, the grenade, the warhead, the anti-tank ordnance. Simple, and if the target was on the move, it was good out to maybe 100 meters. And if it was a stationary target, 150. And if you had a really good grenadier, he might be able to hit something at 200 meters. The problem is that the warhead's moving rather slowly, so it allowed for either wind to kind of muck it up or just to have the target move. But these were mass-produced beginning in 1954 in Russia and were quickly issued on the squadron level. Now let's talk about what has to be done to demill this, because if we don't demill it, it's a Class 3 destructive device, even though it's a metal tube made by a tractor factory. Flipping it over, we can see there's a hole cut in the side here. The ATF requires that the hole be the same diameter as the bore. It also has a metal rod welded in the back. Luckily, it is far enough back that allows the dummy ordnance to go in. Notice we have a very simple front and rear sling loop. It's very basic. And here is one of the pouches. It would carry 3 grenades along with their black powder charges and a cleaning rod. It's not a backpack, it's more of a shoulder pack, a satchel. It's a nice thing, and it has kind of this framework to it. The grenadier himself would carry one of those with 3 rounds, plus his tube, and he would carry some kind of pistol for defense. A Tokarev, a Makarov, sometimes even a Stechkin if you were lucky. The assistant grenadier would carry another one of these backpacks with 3 more charges in it, and he would carry a full rifle. And that was to kind of look out, have the grenadier's back, protect him. And at this time, it would have been the original AK Type 3, also known as the AK-47. Now, the RPG2 was in Russian frontline service for only about a decade, because already by this time, it was not able to penetrate newer armor from the post-Korean War tanks, and also its range was felt to be a little limited. And again, we only had one type of warhead. It was very much just an anti-tank weapon. So beginning in 1961, it started to be replaced by the RPG7, and after a few years it was out of frontline Russian service. However, it would remain in Soviet stockpiles for decades. In fact, in the 21st century, Ukraine is still reporting having several RPG2s just kind of hanging about. More importantly, it was shared with a bunch of communist allied nations. Now, Russia themselves never used the RPG2 in combat, but other nations would, on a very large scale in some cases. It was also produced under license in China as the Type 56, and in North Korea as the Type 58, and in Vietnam, North Vietnam, would produce a couple of versions, the B-40 and the B-50. Now, the B-40 was pretty much a straight copy. The B-50 actually used a larger charge and warhead based on a Chinese round, but it was made in quite limited numbers. So the B-40 was the main thing. And these were used en masse against Americans as well as Soviet-made ones supplied all throughout the Vietnam War. And, I mean, heck, these things pop up in the Middle East, Africa. They're so dirt simple. And again, this can penetrate 180 millimeter of armor. And it's lightweight. The tube is reusable. So it has its purpose. It has its point. But it also had its limitations. And really, Soviet designers and developers were already working on its replacement as it was coming into service. So now, let's move over to that. The RPG2 was the first of its type and was incredibly cheap and easy to mass produce, and was very effective for the 40s and leading into the 50s. But work was already underway to replace it around 1955, 1956, And some of the early projects were the RPG3, which never got out of the laboratory, and the RPG4, which was really only taken from maybe prototype to pre-production at most. The RPG4, though, had a few interesting changes. Just as the RPG1 to 2 went from a 30mm to a 40mm cartridge, the 4 upscaled this to a 45mm cartridge. It also introduced a larger chamber, combustion chamber, and it introduced a taper, kind of a bottleneck at the rear, with a flare at the end called a Ventura nozzle. This would basically squeeze the energy out, giving more push towards the front. And the RPG4 had promise, but for various reasons it was dropped in favor of our RPG7 here. One of the most successful military implements in history. Over 9 million launchers have been built. Countless ordnances, warheads, grenades, rockets if you prefer. And it's literally been used in every combat zone around the world since the 1960s. And is not only still in use today, but still in production today. Hell, they're even doing modernized versions. There's just so much to be said about it. And like I said at the beginning, this model here, this demilled version, is from Gun Parts Corporation, Numeric. And we'll talk about its features, what it does, so on and so forth. What sets it apart from the 2. Not just a different shape to the tube either. The 7 started off with the same 40mm tube as the 2, but it took the enlarged end and the enlarged chamber from the 4. So even though we're still using a black powder 40mm cartridge, we have a lot more expansion room and combustion with the higher velocity. Still using 82 to 85mm warhead, but now we're having, at least in most versions, a secondary engine, a rocket. So this is getting closer to a true rocket-propelled grenade. It still leaves the tube, the firearm, using the what they call the booster charge. That's the second part there. And then the first part contains the warhead and the sustainer engine, which is the rocket. Essentially, it'll pop out with the original ignition like the 2. It's a single action only. And once it gets about 10 meters away, the rocket engine takes off and will burn for several seconds, typically till it's about 500 meters out. As you see, it has a secondary pistol grip, and these are plastic. And the reason is this is a much heavier unit, but let's get back to that in a minute. We have the same type of wooden shield in the middle. And again, the tube, you can definitely see the inspiration. And it has iron sights in the same basic area, but they're much fancier, at least relatively speaking. We have a flip up front with an actual little bit of a hood to it, and it is even slightly adjustable. It's protected when it's folded down, and similar with the rear here. It's protected and adjustable for elevation. And we actually have a actual swiveling sling swivel in the front, but a still basic bar in the back. Still a very simple weapon, but compared to the 2, it's downright fancy, especially its primary optic. Flipping her over and removing the covers. These are separate from the sling. Got a large canvas end cover. It's even buckled, you can remove it. You'll notice on this side we have what looks to be a rail not dissimilar to what's found on an AKM, AK-74, and the Dragunov. It is different, but it is similar enough that it's somewhat compatible. Into the tube. Here's that flared Ventura end. The primary optic is this over here. This is the RPG7, and it has a PSO reticle. It's illuminated for low light. Got the switch here, battery compartment. It's even got this kind of like eyebrow rest rubber end piece, and it slides onto the rail as normal. Comes in this neat little belt pouch. It's got 3 small compartments down below for stuff, and it's got a booklet inside that is very poorly and humorously translated from Russian to English. Common belt loops. Yeah. So this was our primary sighting system. Actually, this wasn't the first time a sight was put on one of these. The RPG2 had a variant first released in 1957 called the RPG2N that featured an early IR sight for night use. It was incredibly big and heavy, but it was the first time a sight was used on one of these. And so when they came time for the RPG7, specifically the 7V that was adopted by the Red Army, a scope rail and sight was a standard item because one of the ideas was to extend the range and accuracy of this over the original 2. And here it is on the launcher. This is a 2.8 power optic. Some say 2.7. Like I said, it has an illuminated reticle. It is adjustable for windage and elevation. And interestingly, it's configured and sighted for a target of basically 2.7 meters, which just so happens to be the height of an Allied M60 tank. Coincidental, I'm sure. And went ahead and put the dummy rocket in, or dummy warhead, to show you. Yeah, the tube by itself, stripped down, no accessories, is still 9 pounds. Once you insert the warhead and attach the optic, you're at over 15 pounds, closer to 15.5 with the sling and everything. So we're looking at something that's about 50% heavier than the 2. And it is still a recoilless, I hate to call it a rifle because it's not rifle, it's a tube. Recoilless firearm. Again, because the black powder charge pushes this out, the sustainer is just there to get it to higher speeds. As I said earlier, the 2 could penetrate about 180 millimeters of armor. Well, the original PG7 warhead could penetrate about 260 millimeters, or about 500 millimeters of concrete. It also had a much greater range. Of course, closer the better, but realistically, it was good out to 300 meters, even 400 meters, and the motor didn't actually cut out on the rocket until 500 meters. So some people could get some pretty good long-range shots with these if they were experienced and or lucky. And unlike the 2, multiple pieces of warhead and ordnance ended up being made for these. Originally just introduced with the heat round, eventually it would get cluster fragmentation, even leaflet, it would even get thermobaric So it became an anti-infantry, anti-lots of things. In fact, in the 80s, they introduced an upgraded version known as the PG7 VR warhead that had 2 charges in it. And this was designed to combat and defeat, at the time, the new ERA, the explosive reactive armor that was appearing on tanks. Essentially, the first charge would ignite the tile, and then the second charge would go through and penetrate several hundred millimeters of armor beneath that, so to kind of burrow in. I don't know, I found that kind of cool. And they continued to improve it, namely through its warhead, and it stays in production. Another cool version is the RPG7D, which is a takedown version meant for the airborne, the VDV. And that is still in use today, as is this. But yeah, this was officially adopted along with its initial warhead for Red Army service on June 15, 1961, and is still very much in service today. It quickly replaced the 2 at the squadron level and would go on. It would actually first see combat in Egyptian hands in 1967 during the brief 6 Days War. And while Egypt did not win that war, the RPG7 didn't have a bad first showing. Russia would soon give some to North Vietnam, who designated these as the B-41, and they would use these at least en masse against the USA during the Tet Offensive in 1968. China would not only use, but would make a few versions of the RPG7. A licensed copy was the Type 65. This technology exchange happened during the brief thaw in the early 60s between Russia and China before things fell apart. It was more or less an exact copy, but there was also the Type 69 that was a lightweight version trying to get down more to the RPG2's weight. This would be built in anywhere from 9 to 12 nations, depending on which source you consult. And there even are some interesting hybrids of RPG2 and RPG7 that are out there. Quite interestingly, too, to me at least, these are made in the USA. The RPG7 USA is made by Airtronic to this very day. So it's so successful that it's made in America. So, yeah. This really is analogous to the AKM. It's used just as much and it's just been as widespread. Like the 2, this was deployed on the squadron level and was typically a team of 2, Grenadier and his assistant. Although they would change up the storage and pouch system a bit. I'm hook on that, aren't I? Yes, I am. The assistant would carry 3, as before, but the Grenadier would only carry 2 rounds, and this was to help make up for the weight of the launcher. Also, as you see, they are going to these canvas carriers that are not framed like the older 2s, and they are actual backpacks. So a little more ergonomic, comfortable, and lightweight. The assistant would carry an AKM, later AK-74, and the Grenadier would either just carry a pistol, sometimes an AKS-74U, just to try to keep weight and everything down. But more range, more penetration, and a lot of use. I guess it should be pointed out that Russia did use these in combat, unlike the 2. They were used by both sides during Afghanistan, all throughout the 10 years they were there. They were also employed by the IRA against the British for a long time. And you can't mention the RPG7 and not mention Mogadishu, 1993, when these were used to shoot down 2 American Black Hawk helicopters. So even into the 90s, they were very effective, especially against, helicopters and other lightly armored things. Even if, maybe their armor penetration wasn't totally up to snuff with the newest Challengers and Abrams. Plunk. The two grips are neat. Neat optic here. And really like how they demilled this one at Numeric. Of course, it does cost more than the one from Atlantic, so, you know, win some, you lose some, right? Very cool, though. But it did surprise me how heavy it was, I'm not going to lie. As to the modern day, the 21st century, the RPG2 is long out of production, at least in the modern world, although some copies, clones, inspirations are kind of being put together, cobbled together, dreamt up in a few out-of-the-way places, and quite a few of old guns from the Cold War still pop up from time to time because this will still penetrate light armored vehicles or unarmored things. It has a purpose, and it's so darn simple. It's just easy to train them on. And the 7 here isn't much more complex, but comparatively so. The Russian military used the RPG7V for quite some time, updating the warhead and optics a bit. In 2001, they adopted the RPG7V2 as a modernized version. It had an updated optic itself, used newer warheads, a few of their little bobs and bells. And alongside it, the RPG7D3 takedown version was adopted. And these today are made by Basalt, which is part of Rostec, the whole conglomerate in Russia. And they are not planning to stop. In fact, last year, 2021, to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the RPG7, they announced a new generation, a new variant, which they said should keep these valid and useful for another 30 years, meaning this very well could be in service for 100 years and still reasonably effective. What they're hoping to accomplish with the new version, they really want to extend the range and accuracy. They're hoping to get it out to about 1 kilometer. And also they want to improve the warhead's penetration and yield up to 30%, so it can take on current armor, 2nd and 3rd generation ERAs. And the Russian military says they're interested, but I don't know how much progress has really been made on that. Either way, it shows that they're very much in production and still considered current. As for these, the 2 here from Atlantic is around 420, 450 without any accessories. If you want the warhead and stuff, that bumps it up to about 500. It's a neat piece of history. Again, it's an original, and it's in good shape. Little dings and nicks on the grip. The 7 from Numeric is more. It's about 750 for the base. And then the optic is around 280 up to 350 depending on which package you get. So quite a bit more money. But I have to admit, it's quite impressive. It's got some real weight to it, and they did quite a great job of demilling it and keeping it looking original. And it, again, it's just so iconic. I picked it up to kind of complete a Russian squadron setup I was working on. And the gear is pretty cool too. Not something we usually do on this channel, but I thought it would be kind of different and interesting. And it does fit the general theme of kind of what I do with Cold War history, so hope you enjoyed it. If you could, do please comment below, like, share, subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please do check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha, and I will catch you very soon next time.